What's happening? Welcome back, folks. I am John Lovell. This is the John Lovell Show. In this episode, we're going to delve into psychological warfare. Former KGB defector, that's Yuri Alexandrovich Bezmenov, gave an interview to an American journalist in 1984.
To change the perception of reality to such an extent, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions themselves, their families, their community, and their country.
The evidence that this has played out and is playing out right now, very late in the game right now, it's frankly overwhelming. Quick shameless plug to prove in this video decrying the evils of communism that we at Warrior Poet Society are still all about that capitalist life. So here's a shameless plug. Shop our website, warriorpoetsociety.com. Russia put in place many decades ago a long-term war plan against the United States. The plan, though, it wasn't tanks and bombs in the traditional warfare sense that you and I might think of. Instead, it was a plan that was much more ambitious and a longer-lasting form of warfare and ultimate overthrow. It was the plan to overthrow the United States through ideological and psychological warfare. Now, to you and me, all this sounds fantastic, kind of sensationalistic, of like, even as I say it, I'm kind of like, really? But I would add to the rulers of a communist country, their rule in the first place is largely obtained through continuous fraud and propaganda. They're the experts at how to overthrow a free country and to rule a populace with an iron fist. This is how these people think. And so applying it to their enemies, it isn't an incredible stretch of the imagination. Rather, it's more of kind of like of course the communists would weaponize this. It's been weaponized so beautifully against their own people. Why not use it against their enemies to subjugate them? So this type of warfare is what they use at home. So to do it to an enemy, that's a real easy mental shift for them. Hard for us, easy for them. So Bezmenov described the communist plan against the West as a great brainwashing that has 4 basic stages. We're going to go through the stages, and I'm going to attempt to show how these phases are realized right here and now in the world we live in. Now, I'm going to attempt to go through these one by one and really expand them and bring the world around us under these points. And holy smokes, very upsetting. Now, the stages. The first stage, Bezmenov said, is the demoralization stage. The second, destabilization. Third, crisis. And finally, normalization. Let's go ahead and jump into phase 1. Phase 1 is demoralization. This phase takes about 15 to 20 years because that's how long it takes to re-educate the very next generation. So this phase is the hardest phase of all the 4. If you pull it off, though, you've got great chances of accomplishing all the rest. They'll end up falling like dominoes. Now, for any who might hear this and be like, whoa, we got to make sure this doesn't happen. I'm like, no. This was already done by the 1980s. It had already been accomplished. Everything else is just re-educating, and even worse, multiple generations. But the process of demoralization, the KGB and the Soviet Union at the time believed that phase 1 had been extravagantly more victorious than they could have even imagined. And what they ended up seeing is that they started a momentum. And it wasn't just the Russians behind this, but they started a momentum, an ideological warfare that was immediately picked up by the Americans and self-perpetuated. So maybe they started something, but now the big proponents of this ideological warfare are Americans doing it to other Americans. So maybe some momentum, you picture a little bit of a swirl, and then we start swirling it as we go down a drain. Here's Bezmenov in his own words. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite the abundance of information, no one's able to come to sensible conclusions in the interest of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. He goes on to say that the demoralization process, once you're a populace or a person is demoralized, it is an irreversible thing. You cannot get them back. This is just what he said, what he believed. I'd like to believe that, no, you can rescue that. And I realized, well, some types of trauma are so great, even if you did make some gains back from it, you never really fully come back from it. There are things that are just too horrible. And I don't really know how, if you catch someone young and you program them a certain way, How hard is that to, of like, no, that's hardwired into the brain. I think that's what he's talking about. When somebody has been demoralized in this way, no amount of evidence can actually even change their mind. This is why there's such a huge difference between left and right. I heard Mike Rowe, I was listening to him on a podcast this morning, and he's talking about America, we're no longer just two different sides of the same coin. Now it's a completely different coin. Have a different set of core beliefs. Our brains work completely different. We're fractured in the middle, and we can't even reconcile because one part of the population, I believe, is completely dehumanized, according to Bezmenov. Now, here's the tricky part of like the left will say, well, this has happened to the right, and the right will say, hey, this has happened to the left. But regardless, we'll say, it has happened. It has happened. And we know this because all of a sudden, we can't even have a conversation with those who are ideologically different from us. The other side seems completely incapable of seeing the world that we see and reasoning. And despite us looking at the same news, the same headlines, the same stuff, no one can really come into any sensible conclusion. We can't get on the same page about anything. This phase, it's called demoralization. I've talked about it. Let's jump into it. What does it mean to demoralize a people? This is phase one, the most important phase, demoralize. One is to remove the morality from a people. Step one, you need to wage war in the moral front. If you're one nation under God, then that means morality comes from a moral lawgiver. And if that's true, then you can't trespass against that and the government can be held accountable for it. So the very first thing you need to do is remove a moral standard. If you remove a God-given moral standard, now if you don't have moral objectivity, you have moral subjectivity. Now, instead of a moral absolute, you have moral relativism. And if you have moral relativism, then morality can change. Instead of God-assigned morality, a contract between God and man, now it becomes what's left. Social contract. Morality is relative, and it's just a social contract that we, the people, decide. And guess who controls that? Well, who controls the legal system? Who controls the media? Who controls the universities? Who gets to teach what morality is? Well, the government. If God is removed, and if moral standard is removed, and we become morally relative, well, then the government gets to decide what is moral. And they can change it. And they'll make it such that if you disagree or rebuff the government in any way, then you're immoral. You're wrong. A people that is morally relativistic can justify any type of crime against humanity. If it's not objective, if it's free-floating, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And once you untether yourself from something fixed morally, you're no longer staked to the land, you're going to be just up and down on the waves of the ocean. That's what moral relativism is, and you can get very, very far away. Before you know it, you think you're morally great for mutilating, castrating, and sterilizing little kids. And you think that's okay.
It's the apotheosis of a quote you recently said from G.K. Chesterton that the loss of God does not result in a society that believes in nothing. It's a society that believes in anything. And, in a society that believes in anything is the society that's ready to say a man can give birth.
The second thing, and Ben was kind of pressing us into this, is the psychological framework being removed. I just finished reading 1984. Again. And I'll go ahead and tell you, if you haven't read 1984, you really should. Ben, have you read it?
I have not read that book.
You got to read it, man. That's super, super good. The very first time you read 1984, you'll read it as a fictitious novel.
Yeah.
The second time you read it, though, you're going to grab a highlighter and read it as a textbook that explains the world around you.
Yeah, I've read Solzhenitsyn, and I just can't believe I haven't read 84. And so I've seen the movie, but I haven't read the book, and that's probably worth getting. So yeah. I will take your advice on that.
Orwell does a deep dive into the psychological framework of the communists. One of the pieces of this is to engage a people in doublethink, as he'll call it. This is a world where not only are the authoritarians waging war morally so that you could believe completely antithetical things to the value system that may be that of your parents. You're untethered psychologically as well. The laws of logic are in flux. The laws of logic become as relative as the moral laws. we're all relative. And so 2 plus 2, well, it equals 4, but maybe it's 5, maybe it's 3. Maybe, you know, in such and such case, it could change. It's all psychologically kind of up for grabs. Orwell calls this process as doublethink. And what basically the whole point is to continue to demoralize a people so that the government is always right. Whatever they say, no matter how contradictory, they're always right. And so that's the idea. And you have to basically be able to control speech. And then through speech, you control their mind. And so that you're able to make thought crimes. You can't think that. You can't say that. And in so doing, you make this disjointed world that's completely disconnected from reality. And the only way you can follow the governments that be is if you accept a certain amount of contradictory belief in your head so that you can even function. Now, this doublethink, it sounds like something impossible. It's like, oh yeah, but who would ever fall for that? No one's going to do that. No one's going to doublethink. And so what I did is I took this idea of doublethink and I just brought it into our world right here and now. So here's modern doublethink. And as you'll hear all these terms that are here and now terms, they mean the opposite of what they actually sound like. Gender affirming care. Think about what that means. It's to destroy your actual gender through mutilation, castration, and sterilization. Pro-choice means you can kill your own baby and therein take away all their choices. For your safety means submission to new tyrannical laws. For your safety, we're going to make you a slave, one federal law at a time. Social justice. Is social justice about justice? Doesn't even pretend to be. Social justice is about creating current injustice to make up for alleged past injustices. Hate speech. This terminology is a psyop to make free speech seem evil and controlling speech seems good. You can't say that, and to silence someone, that's morally good. To censor someone, morally good. To cancel someone, morally good. The term hate speech is a cudgel to make those who are free speech advocates seem evil. It's to control people's words, so ultimately you can control their thoughts. And when you look at the list that I just read out, the left buys into this hook, line, and sinker. They don't see any hypocrisy logically with it because their brains can't actually even process it. You can point it out to them, and they're still not going to see it. They can't see it. Doesn't mean to me that we shouldn't try, but at least gives explanation of like, why can't they see it? It's so obvious. It's so obvious. How can they not see it? They're demoralized. Now, I'm not saying I believe that. It's still, I'm not where Bezmenov is. He's like, hey, once somebody is demoralized in that way of like they got into government schools early, they got hit with this and they went to woke universities. And so they came out the other end like this. And this is how they're wired. They can't see any different. And there's nothing you can do about it. I'm like, man, I don't know if I accept that conclusion, which, by the way, would be a sign of demoralization.
Oh, that's clever. That's clever.
But I just don't like the idea that somebody is beyond redemption, because theologically, I don't believe that is so. But I do recognize certain parts of trauma can always cause certain scars that you may always limp from. That was phase 1, guys. Phase 2 is destabilization. According to Bezmenov, this is a 2 to 5 year process. And basically, it targets essential structural elements of a nation. That's economy, that's foreign relations, and that's defense systems. In this phase, you're breaking up all the old institutions of power and you're replacing them with something that's more communistic. So in this, a free market economy is going to move into a more socialist one. A free media is going to be moving into a bought and paid for journalism. You would see journalists don't have their own voice. They have to spin a narrative.
Unlike in present United States, there will be no place for dissent in future Marxist-Leninist America. Here you can get popular like Daniel Ellsberg and filthy rich like Jane Fonda for being dissident, for criticizing your Pentagon. In future, these people will be simply squashed like cockroaches. This they don't understand, and it will be greatest shock for them, of course.
Phase 3 is crisis. Now, this phase can only, this phase might just be a few weeks to overthrow a nation. In this, you're going to move people from fear to sheer panic. Now, here, guys, I'm going to step away from Bezmenov. Bezmenov was talking about how this is how the Soviet Union had planned to completely destroy the United States from within through ideological warfare. But he was still thinking in terms of how does this nation destroy this nation? What if, though, and I think this would shock Bezmenov, what if that wasn't ambitious enough? Of like, all right, that was playing out and that could have just been done a long time ago. What if the globalists saw this going up? All right, America's going down the tube. Well, pause. I have a greater plan. Let's do what's happening in the US. We'll extend our timetable out a little bit more and let's go ahead and capture the entire world. There'll be nowhere to flee to. Let's put everything under this control. Well, now I think the timetables, demoralization, destabilization, the crisis phase. Now this would happen on a global scale. It'd be harder to accomplish. But once you've demoralized a population, so let's say all the school systems are teaching the same woke Marxist stuff. Well, you could effectively demoralize the world, and then you could destabilize the world. One, and you can hear this from the Democratic Party, one of what's the big existential crisis? If they don't say racism, which is a global problem, they'll say the climate emergency. It's a global climate emergency. See, it's not a national problem. Our crisis is a global one. Border disputes over Ukraine and Russia, border disputes over Israel and Palestine. You see it? What are all these big border disputes? And they're cataclysmic. They're at home and they're everywhere you look. And it looks like, oh, this is all going to, like a nation should have its own sovereignty. If your house doesn't have walls, you don't have a house. You just got a shelter. You got a lean-to. You got a carport. In the erasure of borders, you erase nations. And when you erase nations, all you're left with is globalization. And that's the goal. The last phase is normalization. That means all of this fear, this crisis, this normalization, the demoralization, it's all happened. And now you want to normalize people into this new way of thinking. So the country's been taken over or the globe has been taking over. And now people settle in to this new reality and ideology. And in normalization, it's all about enforcement. You're going to keep doing the things that you did in the demoralization phase. You're going to control all the newspapers. You're going to control people's speech. You're going to control people's thoughts. You're going to create a surveillance state, a police state. You're going to control the way information works. You're going to keep people very, very poor so that they can't revolt against you. You're going to silence the intelligentsia and make sure only certain ideas go through your university so you can program people, and you'll silence and imprison and black bag any dissenters. And so you're going to freeze people in that state of normalization so that they can't go back to it. I wanted to distill everything we were thinking here into kind of a last warning, my last ditch attempt. If I was going to tweet something to the world and be like, bro, wake up, it'd be this. A people grown spoiled in freedom don't always know just how important freedom is until it's been taken from them. And the travesty is this. They have to die for freedom to be able to get it back. And only in dying for freedom will people realize that freedom is worth dying for. Because there's no living without freedom. There's just surviving. Guys, thanks so much for tuning in. This episode that you've seen is cut short and it's abbreviated. If you see the full thing on watchwpsn.com, you'll understand exactly why I wanted to be able to protect some of this stuff. Because it's kind of scary to have it out there in the ether. So watch WPSN.com for the rest. For those of you who just that grates on you that I would have the audacity to want to protect myself and be a capitalist at the same time in an age where we're programmed to be communistic in thought, I want you to just rip me to shreds in the comments. I want you to just don't hold back. Just hate my soul of like, how dare you not work for free forever?
That's communism.
It is. It is. In a video decrying communism, they espouse communism in the comments over a free market idea.
No.
It's so funny.
We've lost.
You have been demoralized. You got to see it, but you won't. You won't. I am awful, and I get it. I get it, but you won't. Guys, thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.